Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization for Saturday, June 24th. Extraordinary events are evolving as we speak in the nation of Russia. We're going to begin by showing you a presentation, an address to the Russian nation given by President Vladimir Putin yesterday.
Обращаюсь к гражданам России, к личному составу вооруженных сил, правоохранительных органов и специальных служб, к бойцам и командирам, которые сейчас сражаются на своих боевых позициях, отбивают атаки противника. Делают это героически, зная, сегодня еще раз ночью говорил с командующими всех направлений. Обращаюсь и к тем, кого обманом или угрозами втянули в преступную авантюру, толкнули на путь тяжкого преступления, вооруженного мятежа. Россия сегодня ведет тяжелейшую борьбу за свое будущее, отражает агрессию неонацистов и их хозяев. Против нас направлена фактически вся военная, экономическая, информационная машина Запада. Мы боремся за жизнь и безопасность наших людей, за наш суверенитет и независимость, за право быть и оставаться Россией, государством с тысячелетней историей. Эта битва, когда решается судьба нашего народа, требует единения всех сил, единства, консолидации и ответственности, когда в сторону должно быть отброшено все, что ослабляет нас. Любые распри, которыми могут воспользоваться и пользуются наши внешние враги, чтобы подорвать нас изнутри. И потому действия, которые раскалывают наше единство, это, по сути, отступничество от своего народа, от боевых товарищей, которые сражаются сейчас на фронте. Это удар в спину нашей стране и нашему народу. И именно такой удар был нанесен по России в 1917 году, когда страна вела Первую мировую войну. Но победу у нее украли. Интриги, склоки, политиканство за спиной армии и народа обернулись величайшим потрясением, разрушением армии и распадом государства, утратой громадных территорий. В итоге трагедии гражданской войны. Русские убивали русских, братья братьев. А корыстную выгоду извлекали разного рода политические авантюристы, да зарубежные силы, которые делили страну, рвали ее на части. Мы не дадим этому повториться. Защитим и наш народ, и нашу государственность от любых угроз. В том числе от внутреннего предательства. А то, с чем мы столкнулись, это именно предательство. Непомерные амбиции и личные интересы привели к измене. К измене и своей стране, и своему народу, и тому делу, за которое бок о бок с другими нашими частями и подразделениями сражались и погибали бойцы и командиры группы «Вагнер». Герои, которые освобождали Солидар и Артемовск, города и поселки Донбасса, сражались и отдавали свои жизни за Новороссию, за единство русского мира. Их имя и славу тоже предали те, кто пытается организовать мятеж, толкает страну к анархии и братоубийству, к поражению в конечном итоге и к капитуляции. Повторю, любая внутренняя смута – смертельная угроза для нашей государственности, для нас, как нации. Это удар по России, по нашему народу. И наши действия по защите Отечества от такой угрозы будут жесткие. Все, кто сознательно встал на путь предательства, кто готовил вооруженный мятеж, встал на путь шантажа и террористических методов, понесут неминуемое наказание. Ответят и перед законом, и перед нашим народом. Вооруженные силы и другие государственные органы получили необходимые приказы. Дополнительные меры антитеррористического характера вводятся сейчас в Москве, Московской области, ряде других регионов. Будут также предприняты решительные действия по стабилизации ситуации в Ростове-на-Дону. Она остается сложной. Фактически заблокирована работа органов гражданского и военного управления. Как президент России и верховный главнокомандующий, как гражданин России сделаю все, чтобы отстоять страну, защитить конституционный строй, жизни и безопасности, свободу граждан. Тот, кто организовал и готовил военный мятеж, кто поднял оружие на боевых товарищей, предали Россию и ответят за это. А тех, кого пытаются втянуть в это преступление, призываю не совершать роковую и трагическую, неповторимую ошибку. Сделать единственно правильный выбор – прекратить участие в преступных действиях. Верю, что мы сбережем и отстоим то, что дорого и свято для нас. И вместе с нашей Родиной мы одолеем любые испытания, станем еще сильнее.
We want to make sure that none of our viewers and none of the people who work with the LaRouche organization or have worked with the LaRouche organization over either days or decades mistake what is presently going on, not in Russia, but what is going on in the world. Because what you are witnessing in part in the speech, and again, there may be events concerning this about which you are unaware, and we will now proceed to try to give you an idea of what is ostensibly going on as well as what is really going on. This is an ongoing story. Making evaluations on the fly is unwise, but it is useful to at least indicate the state of knowledge of some basic facts at this stage, and then to attempt to supply a sense, a global sense of what is happening, not in terms of this incident, but in terms of using the method of analysis that Lyndon LaRouche developed in his organization from its inception during the 1960s, and then the creation of its Executive Intelligence Review magazine during the 1970s. So what we're going to do now is to play a short excerpt from something that's about 4 hours old. It's from a dialogue between Judge Napolitano and Scott Ritter, who has appeared on our platform on several occasions, and from which we will also be hearing a little later.
I will say this, that events have gone far beyond what Sky News is reporting. Wagner troops have pushed through the city of Voronezh and are heading towards Moscow. They're being actively engaged by Russian air. Helicopters are destroying Wagner vehicles on the highway. This isn't a machine gun nest that's being established out of Moscow. Thousands, tens of thousands of troops are being assembled, including heavy armor, artillery. And Putin has basically said, take the gloves off, put this thing down, and put it down now. The Chechen forces, the Akhmat Special Forces, are being sent to Rostov right now. This is not a situation that's going to last very long. It will be violently suppressed, or at least attempted to be. Wagner made certain assumptions. Prigozhin made certain assumptions. So what a lot of people didn't know is that 2 days ago, prior to this, the Ukrainian intelligence service, they had a series of covert cells that were being positioned in Moscow, were uncovered by the FSB, Russian security, and rounded up. It appears that these cells were supposed to be in place in Moscow so that as Prigozhin began to move towards Moscow, they would carry out a series of attacks, explosions, terrorist events that would terrorize the Russian people, reinforce the notion that Putin was an ineffective leader, and therefore the people of Moscow would welcome Wagner with open arms. This is a concerted effort between Wagner, the Ukrainian intelligence service, and their Western sponsors, in particular the British, to achieve what they've always been looking for, which is what they call a Moscow Maidan moment. We've discussed this. The only way that Ukraine could possibly win this war is if Russia implodes. And having been defeated on the battlefield, we see that, kudos to them. They recruited Prigozhin. There's no doubt in my mind that Yevgeny Prigozhin is working on behalf of foreign intelligence services, carrying out their tasks, and that task is to collapse the government of Vladimir Putin. I personally believe that he won't succeed, but that's what's happening this morning.
So what is happening is that there's a process involving British intelligence at the lead, the United States as well, Ukrainian forces who are collaborating with the Wagner group headed by Prigozhin, which has been attempting a form of coup in Russia. Now, whatever we give you of this type is transitional, transient. Everything will be different probably by the time we finish this program, and therefore drawing conclusions of a particular nature around a particular variety, I should say, around these events is unwise. So we are not producing an analysis, but I do want to call your attention to what you heard President Vladimir Putin say. He said, "Today, Russia is waging a tough struggle for its future, repelling the aggression of neo-Nazis and their patrons. The entire military, economic, and informational machine of the West is directed against us. We are fighting for the lives and security of our people, for our sovereignty and independence, for the right to be and remain Russia." Now, it has been said by Russia that the one condition under which they might use thermonuclear weapons, or certainly the option to use thermonuclear weapons, must be entertained, is if they think they face an existential threat. That is not to suggest that the present actions being taken have the necessary, we don't know what will occur in the next hours. But what's more important is to get an idea of how we got here and why it is that we insist that we have a certain role that's played by British intelligence and also the external intelligence sources that are involved. We will be getting to this analytically later, but we're going to proceed in the way in which we were taught by Lyndon LaRouche. And that is, as he and also Malcolm X used to say, by the way, in order to understand what's going on here, I have to take you all the way around the world. What we want to do is to give a reference discussion that Helga Sepp-LaRouche a few days ago had on Wednesday. And she was asked by Harley Schlanger to sort of summarize her view of several different matters that were erupting, some of which we will also be discussing in just a moment. And so we're going to play that exchange between Harley Schlanger and Helga Sepp-LaRouche now.
Helga, there's much to discuss. There's Blinken in Beijing, African leaders in Kiev and Moscow, rumors of an escalation by Biden and NATO, given that the counteroffensive is not going so well. Also, U.S. presidential candidates Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. both making relatively strong anti-war comments, speaking out against the NATO permanent war. And then there's your initiative for an international peace coalition. So where would you like to start?
Well, it's a quickly developing world indeed. I can make very short comments on all the points you raised. I mean, first of all, the visit of State Secretary Blinken in China seemed to go well. At least he met with Chinese Prime Minister. Then he met with Xi Jinping for half an hour, who afterwards said that the meeting was productive. Now, unfortunately, I think even before Blinken left China, President Biden, in a private fundraising dinner, called Xi Jinping a dictator. And that has caused a very angry reaction by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and their spokeswoman, Mao Ning, called it a absolutely unacceptable provocation. And indeed, you know, I mean, the question is the credibility. If Blinken says one thing, you know, the Chinese have now, you know, had it repeatedly that what Western leaders say doesn't mean much. And then when Blinken says one thing, trying to, I don't know what he said exactly, I didn't have the readout, But, if then President Biden says something like that, then it puts the whole thing into question again. I think this is really a problem. You have at the same time the Chinese delegation with Prime Minister Li Keqiang, I probably pronounce it again wrongly, in both Germany and also then tomorrow going to France for an intergovernment dialogue, which according to the preliminary reports we have here from Germany, was not bad, and that was mainly due to the composition of the delegation, where on the German side, Baerbock and Pistorius, the defense minister, did not participate. So especially from Baerbock, there came no strange remarks, so that was helpful for the discussion. So let's say there is a stronger impulse and statement by German industry right now that it is totally against their interest to de-risk, and de-risk is in any case, some other word just for decoupling, because the end effect would be the same. So I think that went relatively well given the circumstances. Now, obviously, the reports coming from Ukraine, which are now published in a lot of Western media, is that the so-called Ukrainian offensive did not really go well, puts on the question very seriously to bring this horrible war to an end, which is just causing more human lives. And in that context, I must say that the statement which was put out even before his speech in New Hampshire by presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, that he again quoted the statement of the former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, who said that, the peace talks were actually on the verge of succeeding in March 22, and that it was then the intervention of especially the British Boris Johnson who ruined that, because Johnson gave the message that NATO insists that the war goes on. So I think this is very important. And then Kennedy said that he demands that Biden asks two apologies, one from the American people, because he has led them into the U.S. Army in de facto in a terrible war, which is totally against the interest of the American people, and secondly, more importantly, to the Ukrainian people, because it has destroyed or is destroying their country. So I think this is very important. And I think that I did not have time to read the Kennedy speech, which he gave yesterday. I just saw some notes about it. He's calling for the U.S. to return to the peace policy of Kennedy. I mean, this is essentially what we had put out in an appeal to the next president of the United States to do exactly that. We have started to collect many signatures from around the world, because lots of people in the whole world want that the United States becomes a power of peace again. So I think this is very encouraging, because, you have Trump, who absolutely found some harsh words on the war policy, who will be a candidate no matter what the legal, prosecution of Trump will be. So you will have, in all likelihood, Trump on the Republican side, and in all likelihood, Kennedy on the Democratic side, which means that there will be, for the first time since a very long time, a real election campaign in the United States. So this is very important. Now, I have been warning against the falling into an election mania on the side of the Americans, because, as George Washington said when he left office, people should not fall into the trap of political parties, because parties tend to be, interest representatives, and therefore not the national interest, which naturally a presidential candidate could easily overcome by truly speaking for the interest of the entire country, which naturally requires a lot. So, and especially because the main decisions about where the world will go, war or peace, financial collapse or a new paradigm of a new economic system, these decisions in all likelihood will be made long before November 24. And therefore, it is important to keep an international focus on, where the world is moving. So I think this is a very interesting environment, where options do exist. And while the danger of war remains extremely high, there was discussion that not only did Russia put now tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus, but the US is talking about putting tactical nuclear weapons into Romania and Poland. The Russians have answered very strongly against that, because that's the places where the American missile defense systems have been installed. And, it's very clear that they can be transformed from defensive into offensive systems in an extremely short period of time. So I can only say the war danger is not less, it's growing. And this is why our international peace coalition efforts are so extremely important. And we had the second very successful discussion. More people, more forces are joining. And, I think that is definitely an answer we have to have against this growing war danger.
So what we wish to present to you is a means to deliberate on the events that are unfolding, for which an evaluation still has to wait because of the nature of the unfolding of the events. In other words, how do you evaluate something as it's happening? Why is that important to you? The number one threat to the planet is instant global warming through thermonuclear war, not the climate change that people have been led to mistakenly focus upon. We're in a circumstance in which the most important thing going on in your life today, whatever you may think, is whether or not thermonuclear war becomes an actionable proposition sometime in the next hours, days, and weeks. And it is not the case that the electoral cycle of the United States or of any other nation bears remote resemblance to the actual requirements of what must be done by the American and other populations at this stage. We're going to do today, we have two guests, Bill Jones and Ray McGovern, both of whom have been with us before. And what we're going to do is, instead of allowing for a misfocus on the events in Russia, a kind of wrong-headed comic book focus, we're going to begin with China. We're going to begin with some of the elements of what Helga has referenced in terms of recent developments during the week in China. And we're going to start with Bill Jones of the China desk of EIR, so that we might be able to get a sort of a picture in relief of what we actually have to think about in order to be able to address properly the unfolding circumstance that we find going on right now. So, Bill, welcome, and take it away.
Okay, Dennis, let me begin talking about the China situation by referring to what President Putin said about the 1917 situation, the end of World War I. The similarities are tremendous. I mean, you look at Ukraine, you look at southern Russia, the Donbass. After the revolution, as Russia was in chaos, British and French troops moved into Crimea and into southern Russia to support those that were in rebellion against the new Soviet government. That was the Don Cossacks. The Ukrainians had already allied themselves with the Germans to create a German protectorate in Ukraine. And the idea from the British end was that if we can create between Russia and Germany what is called this intermarium, or this space, geographic space, which is militarily armed, it would mean that these two powers were no longer major powers and that the British would really control the continent. That was the focus then. That is the focus now. And you see the tremendous role that the British are playing in Ukraine, which is similar to what they had during the post-war period. That policy has remained the same. So we're in a sector again of what we had after the destruction of the Soviet Union, when people were worried because there were now 3 nuclear powers: Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And nobody knew who was going to govern in these. And the question was, if there is chaos there, it could lead to nuclear war. Something similar, the specter of something similar is hanging over the situation today. Although I agree with Scott, I think that it's very much in control, because I don't think Mr. Prigozhin has the support that he probably hopes he has or would have or would be able to develop in moving north to Moscow. The same thing is, of course, happening in the Asia Pacific. What has been done over the last 20 years, if we look at the situation of U.S. policy towards Ukraine, towards Poland, it was no longer specifically a military operation. It was soft power to bring these countries into the orbit of the British, or now the Anglo-Americans, in order to build up that kind of a barrier against Russia in this case. Similarly, in the Asia Pacific region, China, which has become the major economic producer today, on which the United States, its production apparatus, its supply chain, everything is very much dependent, is now under pressure from the United States to try and prevent and to stop, if possible, its development. And they're doing it in the same way by trying to use the so-called soft power of the United States, the influence it has, transforming that into a defense alliance, similar to what had been done with the expansion of NATO. There is no NATO per se in the Asia Pacific. There are ideas that it should be expanded. But at the moment, it's individual countries along the Pacific Rim which are now being brought into the orbit, both in terms of economic relations with the United States, closer economic relations, and defense relations. That includes countries like Japan. The Philippines, unfortunately, has fallen into the trap, and Australia, which has always kind of been the part of the Anglo-sphere in the region. And the idea is to surround and to contain China, and Taiwan is absolutely essential in this. I'll get back to that in a minute. The Blinken visit, there was a desire of sorts from the U.S. side that they could not cut off China entirely. I think a lot of this was coming on the economic side. The United States is in a major financial crisis. We saw that with the debt ceiling debate. The United States, the biggest debt in the world. Now it's even bigger. And the question, nobody's asking the question, how is that debt going to be paid? They're spending money without limit, and they're spending money in particular to finance this war in Ukraine. But at some point, that debt will have to be paid, or it will lead to a blowout of the financial system, which is more likely than it ever being paid. There are ways that it could be dealt with in major financial reform, but that is not something that the New York, London banks, which control policy of the United States today, are interested in. But they did not want to break those ties entirely, because there is a tremendous economic relationship there, both in terms of the goods being produced that we're buying from China, the financial arrangements. China has a great deal of treasury bills, which they're selling rather rapidly these days. And also the role of China as an economic driver of the world economy is absolutely essential. One of the few countries that had a reasonably high rate of growth this year compared to all the other countries. So they want to do it. The Chinese also would have liked to have greater communication with the United States, but given the policy, given the antagonistic, given the hostile policy of the U.S. To China over the last few years, they were very hesitant, and they were not prepared to have some representative, some high-level representative of the United States going over there and pointing the finger at them on human rights, on this and that, all these bogus issues to ridicule them and humiliate them. They weren't going to have that. But at a certain point, through discussions that had been ongoing in various locations, they felt that there could be a meeting that would be somewhat a meeting of equals, where they would have the mutual respect that they have called for. So Blinken went there, had extensive discussions with Foreign Minister Qin Gang, who was the ambassador for about 2 years here in the U.S., was very acquainted with the situation here. All of the, as far as I understand, all of the issues in the China-U.S. relationship were discussed and were not worked out, but were nevertheless put on the table, so everybody knew, each side knew where the other stood. That led to another visit with State Councilor Wang Yi, who was the head of the foreign policy grouping within the Chinese Communist Party. And during the course of these discussions, it was always emphasized that they would have high relations with the United States, but the relationship must be on an equal basis and have the idea of mutual respect. There were also a number of things that they always refer back to. That is the one China policy. We do not want independence from Taiwan. We are not supporting independence in Taiwan. Also, that they treat China as an equal, and that there's non-interference in Chinese politics, and there's no attempt to try and change the political system that is in the People's Republic of China. Those are issues that President Biden had assured President Xi at their meeting in Bali last year the United States would uphold. Blinken, going back there, of course, reiterated those issues. And as he went in there, it was unclear where things would go. And so, of course, after the 10-hour meeting with the foreign minister, I think it became very clear that this would be a relatively positive visit. The other question was, would Secretary Blinken meet President Xi? Now, the decision was made, and I think rightfully so, that President Xi did give a courtesy meeting to Secretary Blinken. But the day before, President Xi had met with Microsoft's Bill Gates, and the two of them, I don't have pictures of this, but the two of them were sitting in chairs as usual in these high-level meetings, talking to each other in a very friendly manner. That was not the meeting with Blinken, because I think they wanted to make clear to the U.S., maybe also to make clear to the Chinese people, that this relationship was not entirely on an equal basis yet. That President Xi went into a room in which the American delegation and the Chinese delegation were sitting on two sides of a table, and President Xi was at the top of the table talking to Secretary Blinken. And he reiterated the points that had been taken up by the foreign minister, the points that had been emphasized by President Biden. He sent his greetings to President Biden. He said he would be looking forward to meeting with him at some point in the future. It was very cordial, but also very formal, unlike a lot of other meetings he had, because the relationship was still at a very tenuous stage. He went back, and then, of course, you had what Helga said, that he called Xi Jinping the dictator. This caused a tremendous furor privately among people in Beijing when they saw this or heard this. They did not, however, make this into a major issue. You didn't see much of this. I don't think you saw anything of it in the Chinese press as far as I could see, because I think they didn't want to rouse the Chinese people against the person of the American president. Because if the conflict became a conflict with the president himself, how could they go back to the things that he had promised in this meeting with President Xi last year? So that was played down. I think more significant and more substantial, in that respect is what has been done since then. A number of pieces of legislation to increase the defense spending to Taiwan. There was also more importantly, a CFR report, which indicated that if you want to defend Taiwan, you've got to make sure that they have the capability to, meet any kind of threat that the People's Republic of China could throw against them. In effect, what this is, regardless of whether you say, you accept the one China policy or not, if you would arm Taiwan to the teeth, and if you would arm it in collaboration with foreign forces, with the United States or with the Japanese. The Japanese now have said they will move some of their troops to the part of the Philippines, which is closest to Taiwan. This is a very aggressive move, and it's been seen so by the Chinese. But if it became effectively a defense satrap to the United States in this circle of containment, this would probably be a point that would lead to war in the Pacific. It is unacceptable. It's unacceptable in terms of the legal foundations in which the island of Taiwan has belonged to China for hundreds of years. This was reasserted after World War II by the United States, which was in charge in the Pacific largely in those days, that those islands that had been taken over by Japan would be returned to their rightful owners. In this case, it would be Taiwan. Now, that effectively did not happen to the extent that the United States then had a defense agreement with the forces of Chiang Kai-shek, which were then holed up on the island of Taiwan. But that legal aspect was still the case. It had not changed things. The fact that they couldn't take Taiwan. If they had had a navy at the end of the war, they probably would have taken Taiwan. But China at that time was not very well developed, had just been through World War II, playing a decisive role against the Japanese in collaboration with the United States. And then they had this civil war. So they were not really in a position to make a move into Taiwan. But the fact of the matter that it still belonged to China was generally accepted by the world community. A lot of people, of course, the United States did not, but at the point that enough motion was built among the developing sector countries who understood what was at stake, where they were able to support the role of China in the United Nations. The U.S. had put this so-called Republic of China, of Chiang Kai-shek, in the UN seat after World War II, in spite of the fact that he had no control over mainland China at all. He had been forced out of there. But that was changed by the 1970s, really with the help and the force of the developing sector countries, which had become a major player within the United Nations. Many new independent nations came out of World War II, and those independent nations went into the United Nations organization, thus giving support for a shift in the situation now. So that's the legal thing. There's also the defense side of things. And this is extremely important because if you look what had happened in terms of what was going on in Europe, that the United States pushing NATO, a military alliance, right up to the border of Russia, there could be no other alternative than that this would lead to conflict. And of course, the major sticking point at that time was, of course, the issue of Crimea, which was for several hundred years now has been Russia's gateway to the Black Sea, was also being claimed by Ukraine, which is not really all valid either, because it was given to them when they succeeded after the fall of the Soviet Union to move the nuclear weapons from Belarus, move them from Ukraine back to Russia. The Russian government of Putin, not Putin, but of the stooge, the Bill and Boris show, agreed that Crimea would go to Ukraine, with an agreement that these Russian naval forces would remain in the Crimea. It was still a friendly relationship, although not a lot of tensions existed there, but it was not one in which Ukraine was going to make moves against their largely Russian-speaking population, nor against Crimea. As that changed, of course, this became a defense issue, and was one of the reasons that President Putin, for national security reasons, had to make the decision to move into that part of Ukraine. Now, I want to show you the map of the Asia Pacific to give you an idea of how this relates to what's going on there. If I can get that up, I don't know. Maybe not. Okay, if that comes up at some point. There we go. Okay. So you want to look at this. Look at, of course, one's the English version, one's the Chinese version. This is a map that's used very much by the Defense Department. This is actually from, I think, Defense News, or they had gotten it from somewhere. And you look at the island chains. Of course, you see the People's Republic of China is there. And you see the chain going from the north with Japan, and then on opposite South Korea, which is also being brought in to this conglomerate of forces containing China. And then you go down and you have the Philippines. You go further, you have Indonesia, Malaysia. Of course, they're not going to get involved in this, or at this point they're not. And then you go up to Vietnam, which is being feted and courted by the United States. The aircraft carrier, the Reagan, is going to be visiting a naval base in Vietnam very soon. That's one of the first visits they have had there for many, many years. But if you look at the middle of this thing and you look at where Taiwan is, it's really veritably a stone's throw from the People's Republic of China. So what it is, if Chinese defense planners who are looking at this map, they see that this thing is coming down and encircling effectively the People's Republic, almost preventing access to the sea, certainly access to the second island chain if it were to be completely closed. And Taiwan is like the stopper in this thing, that if Taiwan became a military asset effectively of the United States or of the Anglo forces in that region, that would really effectively stop up China's access to the sea. And of course, everybody's talking about, oh, China is, freedom of navigation, blah, 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 blah. They have not impeded in any way whatsoever the freedom of navigation of civilian ships going through their waters, even through the Taiwan Straits. But the United States would probably have, in a case in which there were political tensions with China, would not have the slightest doubt in using their military might to hem in Chinese vessels, both civilian and or defense vessels, into that first island chain. So this is the policy that you're seeing developing now, and everything is being put up. The CFR report talks about this specifically, of Taiwan has to be this, be able to defend itself, but it's not Taiwan defending itself against attack by the Chinese. It's Taiwan as a tool in this defense containment chain, which is trying to be put around the People's Republic of China. So it's similar to what we had in the European scenario. It could lead very well to war in Taiwan. Everybody's saying, you talk to all these defense people that say, oh, it's inevitable, we got to prepare for it because it's going to happen. Not necessarily the case. The People's Republic of China has broad support for its policy, not from these countries that are involved in this particular operation, but in most of the other countries of the world, which comprises the global majority. And what they are doing now is not looking for how we're going to invade Taiwan or what we're going to defend ourselves against the attack. Those plans are being made as in every other country. But in this case, what they have is a diplomatic offensive based on economic development policies. You saw this, as Helga mentioned, the visit of Li Qiang to Europe, stopping in Germany, stopping in France. France is probably the first country that recognized the People's Republic of China, even long before the United States. They have long relations with them. There's been very good discussions. Both the Germans and the French, who have agreed, who are in the dragnet of the European Union, and have had to play ball with them, nevertheless have their own self-interest. And these meetings, I think, saw some of this self-interest coming out, at least from the industrial people, and to some extent from the political leadership. More importantly, Li Qiang took part, and I think played a major role in this conference that President Macron, for whatever reasons, set up for global financial development. It's probably a dual-edged situation for him. They know that China has been, making headway among the developing countries because they've been really the only country that has supported these kind of infrastructural projects, which the United States had stopped doing really in the 1970s, letting Africa go to hell in a handbasket. And this has created a great deal of optimism in that part of the world. And I think Macron is also trying to get on top of this to some extent himself. But Li Qiang's visit there, of course, gave this an entirely different aspect, because he's coming there on the back of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has created development for literally hundreds of countries who are part of this: railroads, power stations, hospitals, medical aid, you name it, they have been involved in. BRI has been a part of this. And he also emphasized the fact that this is an important thing that has to be done, and that the countries of Africa, the countries of the developing sector, should look in all directions for the financing that's available to create these development projects. So in one sense, that whatever Macron's view of this was, the fact of Li Qiang being there has made this into a very important impetus for the kind of development projects of which the BRI is, I think, really the paradigm. Now, what the effects will be now after he comes back is difficult to see. But it is the case that in spite of the EU countries being placed in a straitjacket by the European Union, there are these real effective national interests that they have to realize if their population is going to grow, if their population is going to be happy. There was also a meeting here in Washington, which is very interesting. The Chinese ambassador at the Organization of American States, that's all the states of Latin and Central America. And he made a speech there too, talked about the development, but talked about Chinese democracy, which is something that nobody really knows exists, and explain the nature of how it works, how people in China have the ability to affect changes in their situation through this system of congresses local people's congresses, which are endemic throughout the country, and which at the basic level involves everybody who wants to have a say. And this was very important intervention because of Biden's trying to convince people that we got this democracies on the one hand, the autocracies on the other hand. So he brings Narendra Modi to Washington to celebrate this. And of course, Modi says democracy is in our DNA, and India is a democracy, a very troubled one, but it has its difficulties, and the U.S. was going to look the other way in order to bring them on board. I don't think that will succeed either, as what is in India's DNA is this non-alignment from the get-go. And I don't think whether they work together with the United States, they get defense goods from them, they're certainly not going to align with them. So that's the battle as we have it now. And very, very dangerous, danger of war in both the East and the West. But I think that as we see things develop, especially as this the threat of internal strife in Russia is overcome by Putin, you will see some of the other elements of this situation coming to the fore, especially with the upcoming meetings of the BRICS and the various organizations that comprise the global South, which now have become a major force in the world that can no longer be neglected, ignored, or pushed aside.
Bill, I want to thank you for doing that, because what you've also demonstrated there is the role of what people keep separating as economic policy from what people call military strategy. Because what in fact is going on here is that China in particular, the nations of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the nations of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the nations that are cooperating in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially celebrating its 10th anniversary from its having been announced, are moving ahead. They've moved out. There is a breakout for economic development, typified by the hundreds of millions of people brought out of poverty in China. And the war that is being waged against humanity is one in which you take resources that should be being used to end poverty, to fight disease, for education, for healthcare, and so on, and they end up having to be deployed in the direction of war, which is one of the penalties that, in fact, has been imposed in this situation with respect to Ukraine, Russia, and so forth. And we'll have more to say about this. There's quite a bit of many questions that are coming up in the chat. We'll come back to those to visit those in a moment. Before we go to Ray McGovern, I want to reference something that Helga LaRouche brought up, and others have been discussing. Also, even Scott Ritter was alluding to it implicitly, which is some of the remarks that have been being given by presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. over the course of particularly the last week. What we want to do is to reference one statement that he made in New Hampshire, which is nearly completely suppressed in the general mainstream media, which is a very interesting thing to think about as to how suppression of information exists in the United States today. And then there's a second statement that he made, a short statement, on the Joe Rogan show. And we are going to show these before Ray, partially because the actions of the past weeks, which Ray and persons from the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, groups like Pax Christi, other persons involved in what Helga LaRouche has called an international peace coalition. The actions have focused on bringing out the June 10th, 1963 American University speech given by John Kennedy called the Peace Speech. And this is something that Robert Kennedy specifically referred to on June 20th in a speech he gave in Goffstown, New Hampshire, as part of his campaign for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States.
To chart a course for the future of our nation's military and foreign policy, I'll return once again to the words of John F. Kennedy. He said, quote, "America's weapons are not provocative. They are carefully controlled. They are designed to deter and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility. End quote. The current administration is going to be in power for another year and a half, but the danger of reckless escalation and nuclear brinksmanship is real and present. I therefore call on our present leadership to adopt President Kennedy's maxims and to start de-escalating right now. I call on them.
Let's watch some of that.
But what do you think happens when you get into office? Like, if you're talking about your uncle who's assassinated and you believe the intelligence agencies were a part of that, what happens to you?
Well, I gotta be careful. I'm aware of that, and I'm not, I'm aware of that danger, and I don't live in fear of it, at all. But I'm not stupid about it, and I take precautions.
Ray McGovern has been here many times. He's been a very important warrior for the cause of peace. He was a 27-year analyst for Central Intelligence Agency with a specialty on Russia. And he has a particular love for the American University speech and the love for the ideas of the American University speech. And I can't think of a better person given today and what's evolving today to have with us to discuss not necessarily the events of today, but the arc of history that has brought us here. So welcome, Ray. Always good to see you. And
Thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Well, thanks for hanging around and listening to me. I think that I have some interesting news to impart. 10 or so minutes before Dennis started this symposium, we decided that we should do China first, because God knows what will happen with Prigozhin. Well, late breaking. Here's news. Prigozhin has decided he's going to turn around and go back to his camps. Hello? Yeah, this was a voice video that he made, and it looks like the crisis has been attenuated, if not over, partly due to the intervention of Lukashenko from Belarus, to whom Putin turned and said, "Get this guy off my back, will you please?" Now, Prigozhin earlier had been saying, "We're going to Moscow. We're getting to go to Moscow," right? Right. It reminded me of, some of you know Chekhov's play, The Three Sisters. These three old maids. The whole play is about, we're going to go to Moscow. We're going to get to Moscow. And at the end they'll get to Moscow. Okay. Well, Prigozhin not going to get to Moscow. Now, before I go into any explication of that, I'm glad I went second, because I have some comments on China. I thank Bill for his really good historical review. I think we need to have 100 flowers bloom here, because I have real problems with some of his conclusions from the Blinken visit. But just as important, I want to disassociate myself from the earlier comment on climate change. I have to tell you that I'm not a scientist, but the scientists that I respect believe in climate change. And I've been saying that the war in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine can be looked on as the mother of all opportunity costs. Think about it. We're sort of on the way to having international cooperation in fighting this incredible problem, unprecedented problem for civilization. War in Ukraine, all gone down the drain. Not only that, but more and more stuff is being spewed into the atmosphere by the armies engaged. So I want to just make that point in the sense of let 100 flowers bloom. With respect to China, I have a different view. I think it was a debacle. I think that the initiative, I think it's pretty well established, that it was Blinken saying, please, can I come? Please, I'm sorry about the balloon and all, but please, can I come anyway? And the China, all right, you can come, okay? And Blinken went there, in my view, because he realized that exactly 2 years after he had told Biden to tell Putin, we know, Vladimir, we know that you have a big problem with China. You have this several thousand miles of border, and you know that China wants to be not only the supreme economic, but the supreme military power. We know that China is squeezing you. How do I know that Biden told that to Putin? Because Biden said it right after the meeting. He said, no, I'm not appropriate to tell you what I said to Vladimir Putin, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Anyway, and then as he gets on the plane, they're saying, Joe, come on. No, one more word to the press. He says, just remember, Russia's being squeezed by China. Now, those of you who have been awake for the last 2 years know that they got that 180 degrees wrong, okay? It's not a squeeze, it's a fraternal embrace. Suffice it to say that China and Russia are in an alliance that they both describe as exceeding the traditional alliance with no end on the upper end. Oh, what does that mean? Well, Russia is engaged in a war on one side of the world. If it's in an alliance with China, what's China's attitude, or what are China's options on the other side of the world? Do U.S. policymakers and military planners really want to get involved in a two-front war? Well, that's why Blinken went to Beijing, to try to create at least a better atmosphere so people wouldn't fear that the Chinese are embracing the Russians. No, we can play them off. We can still play them off against the Russians. Irrational. And, the fact that he was read the Riot Act for 10 hours, that sort of speaks for itself. The fact that despite President Biden's pleas, I want to see Z, I'm sure there's going to be a meeting pretty soon. Yeah, this year. No invitation to the president. And even the foreign minister. The statement said he was invited, but he didn't say he'd come to Washington. I see it as a complete bust. And then, of course, Biden put the icing on the cake by calling Xi a dictator. Now, I think this is mentioning, and it's an alternative view, and nobody pretends they know all the answers. But if that's the case, then Ukraine is really, really important, because the US and NATO cannot just look at it in European terms. They have to reckon with the notion that China realizes it's next in line for the tender administrations of NATO, and that they're going to support Russia no matter what Russia needs. Now, so far, Russia hasn't needed any military material from China. They do quite well enough in producing and fielding their own supplies. But when push comes to shove, Putin cannot possibly lose, not only because of geography, not only because he's not running out of weapons, but because when the unlikely event that he starts to lose, he can embrace Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping will come to the rescue. I've been saying that for a long time now, ever since they got together, the two of them, in Beijing on the 4th of February 2002, to launch the Beijing Olympics. And I'll just put a codicil on this, because the way I interpreted that from the start was that Putin let Xi Jinping know, look, they're the Ukrainians, trained by NATO, armed by NATO, diddling us for 7 years, are about to pounce on the Donbass. Besides, we've got installations in Romania and Poland that we don't know whether they have cruise missiles in them or not. And all kinds of Nazis running around. We're going to have to invade Ukraine. What do you think? My notion of how Xi Jinping reacted was, you mean after the Olympics are over, right? Discarding all of China's principal stand on Westphalia, okay? You don't invade other countries. Your sovereignty, self-determination, all this business. What Xi Jinping decided is, okay, I'm next after Russia. I'll give you, Vladimir, a waiver on Westphalia. And so the Olympics are over on the 20th of February, 2022. On the 21st, Lugansk and Donetsk declare independence. On the 22nd, they ask for aid. On the 33rd, the Duma approves it. On the 24th, we have the invasion of Ukraine. That's big, folks. And so I think when you look at China, you can't divorce yourself from the situation in Ukraine, and that Putin, in my view, may not have done it. He may not have invaded Ukraine had he not gotten the equivalent of a nihil obstat or an imprimatur or a sotto voce. Yeah, go ahead, Vlad. We realize that we're next. So that's I've made some notes here, but that's pretty much what I wanted to say about China, except for the fact that after the visit, as Bill pointed out, there was more legislation, anti-Chinese legislation, more arms for Taiwan and all that stuff. Well, now, if Taiwan is recognized as a province of China, and that's what one China policy means, isn't it interesting that the U.S. is supplying arms to a province of China? Is Taiwan the only province that the U.S. is giving? Yeah, I suppose it's the only province. I mean, give me a break. It's very, very clear what's happening out there. And it's very, very clear, number one, in my view, the Chinese have no intention of invading Taiwan. That would be crazy. That would be something like Rumsfeld or Cheney would do. Stupid, So what's all this stuff? All this stuff is to buy and sell and make more military equipment, double the size of our Navy out in the East. It's just, this is the pivot to the East. When we ran out of terrorists to fight, we needed an enemy. The East became the enemy, and now we have the West. So let me just end the China segment of my remarks. My first portfolio at CIA as an analyst was Sino-Soviet relations. What I know about China comes from a Russian perspective, but you learn a lot by watching great powers relate to each other. We thought that Russia and China were going to hate each other forever, as they did in the 60s and the 70s, but nothing is forever, okay? They don't hate each other now. When you have a very formidable common enemy, you grow to like each other. And when you have a complementary economy, as China and Russia do, you're natural allies. That is what they have become. And just to mention once more that it was exactly 2 years to the day when Blinken found his way into China just last week, 2 years after the summit, where Biden was reading out of Blinken, who was reading out of textbooks at these fancy schools that I wrote part of the chapters on. In other words, we told everybody they're going to hate each other forever. Not so. Nothing's forever. Okay, enough on China. Now, what about Prigozhin? Well, at first, my first reaction was, he spent altogether too much time in Ukraine. I mean, impetus or feelings toward suicide seem to be rolling around, seem to be contagious in Ukraine. Witness what Zelensky and company are doing with the flower of Ukrainian youth. Suicide, okay? Now, did Prigozhin catch this suicidal impulse? Well, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just megalomania. Megalomania, okay? A fancy word, for illusions of grandeur, when you have a great military success, think about Napoleon, for example, you tend to get a little bit conceited, in the Bronx period, and say, don't get a swelled head just because you got all A's, right? So he's a big military hero, and he lets it go to his head, okay? So what does he do? Well, we've seen what he did. Did he have help? That's the real question, isn't it? Now, I don't know when Scott Ritter sleeps. I guess, well, he's a little younger than me too, but I guess Marines learn how to not sleep better than Army officers. But I think Scott, once again, has it exactly right. Whether or not MI6, the British intelligence agency, and or the CIA gave Prigozhin to believe that all these people have cultivated and the Ukrainians cultivated in Moscow and they're around, we can rise up and you're going to be the next Tsar, much less head of Russia. Prigozhin, you got it made. You got a great following. That is an arrow in the quiver of every intelligence agency in the world. What do I mean? I mean that you play on this. You can get these guys to do the kinds of things that you want. So here's Prigozhin. I'm going to go to Moscow, right? Like the Three Sisters, right? Well, he's not going to go to Moscow. There has been fighting, as Scott Ritter has already reported, and some of his columns have gotten maybe 200 kilometers from Moscow. That's pretty far from Rostov-on-Don, okay? So this is real. And the fallout is going to be, well, Prigozhin, the Chinese used to say, Prigozhin is going to come to a no good end, okay? This is not going to be papered over. I don't know how Lukashenko got him to turn his forces around, but I don't think Lukashenko was authorized to promise Prigozhin some kind of special deal. This is treason. This is treachery. To the degree it was fostered or encouraged by foreign intelligence services, man, that's really serious. Now, unlike uncivilized countries in the world, let me put it that way, the Russians don't shoot you or hang you or electrocute you. But if I were in Siberia, I would be preparing the way for Prigozhin to spend a lot of time there over the next 50, 60 years. That's what's going to happen. Now, how about in Ukraine? Well, as most people know by now, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been put on a pause. You hit the pause button, right? They're not doing real well. And they're actually admitting that Russian defenses are somehow much stronger than we thought. Well, where were they getting their information? Well, from incompetent intelligence officials like April Haines, who sits atop the whole intelligence structure as the director of national intelligence, supervising the CIA, the State Department, NSA, FBI, you name it, okay? And she said just a few months ago, I'm really optimistic about the counteroffensive. It's going to be really great. And besides, the Russians are running out of ammunition and they're running out of weaponry, and they don't have any indigenous capability of building up these things. Huh? She's asked about relations between Russia and China. And what'd she say? She said, China's playing a double game here. It's trying to have it both ways, Every now and then they exchange visits, Putin and Xi Jinping, but talk about the fecklessness of the U.S. intelligence services. And I have to admit that General Milley, he's not the brightest knife in the drawer, but he knows enough about military matters to realize, as he said, nobody can win this thing. Yeah, nobody, certainly not NATO's going to win this. He said that a couple of months ago. Oh, then he changed his mind. Oh, then Secretary Austin said, well, no, wait a second. Now, we're optimistic. That's what we're telling April Haynes, our nominal boss, and we're optimistic. And when one senator or representative says, well, is Ukraine going to win? Well, we've given them, says Austin, we've given them 98% what they need. And we're hopeful, we're optimistic, and we just have to see how it turns out in the coming months, 98% of what they need, right? Now, this puts the U.S. policymakers in the position of saying, now, well, we gave them 98% of what they need, Would that 2% have helped this counteroffensive? And besides, Zelensky, we're having second thoughts about him. Do you know who blew up Nord Stream pipelines? Ukrainian government. Yeah, right. That's the latest. I believe that. I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you, right? We know who did that, but blaming Zelensky? Well, they're very careful. They blame Doluzhny Soluzhny, commander-in-chief who doesn't really appear very much wherever he is, okay? But they blame the Minister of Defense, Zaluzhny, or the head of the commander of all the forces, to put in his frogmen or whatever, and then they went on this yacht, first I heard about this, I thought it was, the beginning of that typical joke, 4 Ukrainians and a medical doctor walk into a bar. A yacht. It made no sense. Then it only makes sense if they're preparing to throw Zelensky under the bus. Now, in my view, Zelensky is not long for this world. The territory has been prepared for them to disavow him, to give him his bundles of cash and let him go to that Italian Riviera place that he has. Just leave him alone, and maybe we can work out some kind of deal before the Russians go all the way to Poland, Romania, and Moldova. Okay, we don't want that. The Russians don't want that. Let them stop at the Dnieper and deal. Last thing I'll say is there is the makings of a deal. Odessa. Now, let me be very specific here. As a Russian intelligence analyst, or an intelligence analyst of Russia, in the old days, we used to read everything that a party first secretary or a Russian president or whatever, what they said. Now it's become quite a task for my printer to print out everything that Putin says in these 3.5-hour speeches and then Q&As, but I do it anyway, okay? Patriotism. And then I read it, okay? And the Q&As are very fertile. And here's one relevant to Odessa. Looked like a canned question, I can't be sure, but this Serbian journalist says, Mr. President Putin, I'm thinking of of going on vacation in Odessa. And I was just wondering, do you suggest that I apply for a Ukrainian or a Russian visa? Pretty clever, huh? Got it? So Putin rises to the occasion. He says, Odessa, a beautiful city. One of the most beautiful cities, a wonderful city. Yes, I really encourage you to go. Odessa. You know, when I think of it, says Putin, it could be a яблоко раздора, apple of discord. Think about your Trojan War, your mythology, okay? It could be an apple of discord, or it could be a way to get people together with different views to work out a solution to problems. We'll have to see how it all pans out. Whoa. Now, Odessa is on the western side of the Dnieper. It's a seaport of major proportions. It gives Ukraine access to the sea. Without access to the sea, what's left of Ukraine becomes simply, we used to call it the breadbasket of Europe. Well, it become at least the farm, the agricultural center of Europe, that if the Black Earth holds, right? But without the port, they're just that. So there's the makings of a deal there. And, I would just reiterate, Putin is a lot smarter than Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and George Bush all put together. So are his military advisors. And they know that it would be really stupid to try to occupy Western Ukraine. It doesn't make any sense. I think they will do that only as a last resort. What I see is the makings of a deal now. They'll go, I think, to the Dnieper River west. There's not much to impede them now, the Russian forces, and then they'll want a deal, okay? And they'll want a cordon sanitaire. They'll want a buffer zone or a demilitarized zone that will keep those Western weapons of 150-mile range 150 miles away from the Dnieper, okay, on the western side of the Dnieper. And a deal can be arranged. And for God's sake, the blood will stop flowing, the blood of these young Ukrainian people. Lastly, I'll say that that's really where our focus should be. The first principle of first aid is to stop the bleeding, right? For God's sake. The situation is not going to get any better. Let's make all our efforts to persuade Zelensky or whoever replaces him that not only the Pope, but Zula of Brazil, Xi Jinping of China, the Ukrainians, others have all called for ceasefire deal in place. The makings of a deal is there. The Ukrainians will have to give up substantial parts of their territory. That's just the way it's going to be. And whose fault is that? It's the fault of who started this whole thing, and that is the West, and that can be demonstrated. You don't have to go back to 1989 or 1990. You can just go back as far as 2008, when the Russians told our ambassador in Moscow, William Burns, look, this is a red line for us. You try to get Ukraine in NATO, and in effect, Ukraine became ipso facto part of NATO when all these weapons went in there just a couple of years ago. So, long story short, it's all connected. And I think the Chinese and U.S. policy towards China is motivated now by a realization that it's a two-front war in store for us, that Ukraine is not going to win on the ground, and that the only prospect in which nuclear weapons are likely to be used, hopefully not, but likely to be used, would be on the 5% chance that Russia starts to lose in Ukraine. Mark my words, I give it 5%. 5% is a lot when you talk about nuclear war. Okay, so let's just assume, let's postulate that Russia is pushed back into Russia and we start building more missile bases, not only in Poland, Romania, but in Ukraine and elsewhere. What's Putin going to do? Well, he already has said, if he senses an existential threat that he can't meet in any other way, tactical nuclear weapons are, well, as he puts it, we have all these weapons at our disposal. Don't think that we won't use them. 5%, well, when you talk about the stakes here, 5% is enough to get me very worried, but it needs to be put into perspective, and we have to watch how things progress in the next couple of weeks. Mark my words, for what it's worth. I don't think that I would bet on Zelensky being in power for maybe another month, and if that's the case, then whoever follows him, and it may be the military. After all, the military are the ones that are being sacrificed and being forced to order their troops into getting killed. So maybe the military will rise up and say, look, let's make a deal. We still have some forces extant. We can talk about how we demilitarize, how we make what's left of Ukraine neutral. And of course, the supreme irony is that deal could have been reached. That deal, folks, was reached at the end of March of last year and sabotaged by the Victoria Nulands and the Boris Johnsons of this world. I'll end on that unhappy note.
That's fine, Ray, because we have a lot of engagement today. There are hundreds of people who are actually hooked up and are watching as we speak. And because of that, I want to say a couple of things, both to them and to general, to everyone, that we'll be viewing this in the next days. It's time to act, and we have ways for you to act. There's an international peace coalition, which has been largely the brainchild of Helga Sepp LaRouche. Ray's very involved in it. Maybe he'll say something about that a little later. But what the concept of this is that we have to use every medium at our disposal to allow people to get into the business of not merely speaking out, but causing their voice, like in the case of the walls of Jericho. You can sometimes, if you know how to sing properly and you know how to use the right kinds of musical instruments, you can create a standing wave. And that standing wave will blow apart the most impregnable obstacle. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do. What we'll do here is just, before we go to questions, there are many questions, and we are going to get to these questions. In fact, I'll pose one. Before we go to it, I want to show something of an exchange between U.S. Senate candidate Diane Sayre, who had Scott Ritter on her show last night. And they got into a certain kind of discussion. So we want to play that for people. But I'm going to pose this question now to Bill and to Ray. And then when we come back, I'll pose it again so they can answer it. And what it is this. There are two different people asking a similar question. What happened to diplomacy in international relations? Why is it that it worked in the past, for example, during the Cold War, and does not work now? That's from Munasha. Then a variation on that is why is the cooperation of the growing among the nations, especially of the developing world, viewed as a threat to NATO's security? Why is the peace proposal toward Russia-Ukraine peace viewed skeptically by the United States and the European Union? I think that refers particularly to the proposal made by the 6 African heads of state who visited Kiev and Moscow. And as I said, I'll repeat those questions when we come back, but I wanted those already to be in the minds of both Bill and Ray. So let's show the video from last night, or Scott Ritter in conversation with Diane Sayre.
Important. Also, there used to be a distinction between the United States, our foreign policy as envisioned by someone like John Quincy Adams, and the British. And I think the British are playing a horrific role. You have the game of pitting Russia against Germany, which led us to World War I and II. I think that's part of what's going on here. I also partly think, is there an element of trying to make sure that relations between the US and Russia are absolutely irreparable? Not that we're not doing enough ourselves, but you think about Liz Truss texting Blinken in the minutes after the Nord Stream pipeline is blown up. It is done. The role, I'm not sure. I heard Colonel McGregor saying that the SAS, I believe, was involved in the Kerch Bridge explosion. It is very typical. This geopolitical outlook definitely is one of empire and really needs to be rejected by the American people. But at this point, the only way we can reject it, I think, is by being active, being visible, and being in the streets. But what thoughts do you have on that, Scott, and then I guess Stephen?
Well, Diane, you know that I have been calling for mobilization of the American population, a necessary mobilization to voice their support for disarmament, to voice their support for nuclear arms control, to voice their support for improved relations between the United States and Russia. When I started this movement, so to speak, the idea was to get people mobilized by June of 2024 to replicate the million-person rally in Central Park that took place in June of 1982 that created the conditions politically for Ronald Reagan to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. But I think what we're looking at right now is that we don't have the time. We can't wait till June of 2024. That the moment is now. RFK Jr. is 100% correct. The time is now. Ladies and gentlemen, there may not be an America by June 2024. There may not be a world by June 2024. We can't sit here and say, well, we have a year to mobilize. We don't. We literally don't have a day to mobilize, but unfortunately, we got to play with what we got to play with. The time is now. The moment is now. We have to send a signal to Joe Biden, to Lindsey Graham, to everybody that it is politically unacceptable, that there will be there will be a cost, a political cost which will be terminal for their political trajectory of anybody who endorses this thinking. I just came back from Russia, 26 days, where I had the wonderful opportunity to interact with the Russian people and get a feel for what the Russian opinion is about the United States. And I will tell you right now that Russia would be receptive to legitimate moves by the United States to de-escalate, that Russia is not suicidal. They don't want this nuclear conflict, but Russia is also determined never again to allow their nation to be bullied by the United States, to be intimidated by NATO, and that they will respond accordingly. Which means that if the United States and NATO continues to bully, continues to pressure, continues to seek to intimidate, that the Russians will be compelled to move in a direction that leads us to the inevitability of nuclear conflict. This threat is real. The time is now. RFK Jr.'s speech should be listened to by all Americans, and they should they should take guidance from that. And then we have. Let me ask American, anybody listening right now, okay, it's one thing for me to say, hey, could you make some time a year from now, June 24th, come to Central Park and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and we'll play nice, and we'll have this wonderful demonstration where we, assert the will of the people. And I was like, maybe, I don't know. My cousin Jenny has a wedding soon after. Can I make time? What if I told you right now that you had one choice? Go to the street right now to surround the White House, to surround the Pentagon, to shut Washington, D.C. down right now, or you'll die. Guaranteed. If you don't get up right now, go rush the White House, surround the Pentagon, and let it be known that this is unacceptable. If you don't do that, you will die. Guaranteed. I bet you'd find the motivation to get up and do something.
So again, just to repeat the question, and the reason I wanted to have that shown, besides the fact that I think that what Scott is getting at is right, and I think the people that are on, there are hundreds of people on right now. Those people all began to work as of today on what we've been working on. A lot could be achieved, but I just wanted to place our discussion kind of in that context. So again, the question was, what happened to diplomacy and international relations? How come it worked during the Cold War and doesn't work now? And specifically, why are the peace proposals toward Russia and Ukraine being viewed so skeptically by the EU and by the United States? So let me start with you first, Bill.
Well, one of the reasons is, of course, that the United States really hasn't had any diplomacy over the last few years. Or if they have a diplomacy, it's a reversal or a twist on speak softly and carry a big stick, and it's shouted from the rooftops and carry a big stick. It's like the bully in the bullpen. Was really to knock people on the head, but have nothing to offer. China, on the other hand, has had a very successful diplomacy, and they have their own idea of the Chinese way of diplomacy, which they call it Xi's way of diplomacy. And of course, Xi Jinping is probably their most important diplomat. He has probably spent more time in diplomatic activity than any other Chinese leader during the time of the People's Republic of China or over the long 5,000 years of Chinese history, and has done it very successfully because the Chinese do speak softly, but they bring with them high-speed rail. So they have the principles that agreements between nations must respect the other nation's system, the other nation's independent road to development. It must be based on mutual respect, and there must be win-win cooperation. That is, if we sign an agreement, you've got to win something and we've got to win something. Otherwise, there is no agreement. And we've seen that's been very successful. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. 160 nations now who have signed agreements on that. This is really incredible. It's the biggest development project in the world in the history of mankind, and has had tremendous effects in creating a new sense of optimism, a new sense of development. And this is how the Chinese approach things, whereas the United States became more and more bullyish because of the success of Chinese diplomacy and because of the impossibility in one sense. I mean, they're trying an impossibility in one sense to offer what China has to offer to these countries. We don't build railroads, much less high-speed railroads. We don't even build them here in the United States. That has become a model that people have looked to. What's going on in China? How many people have we brought out of poverty? I'd probably have to ask how many people have put into poverty over the last 10 years, given the present economic conditions. And so that's the big difference. And so the only reaction the United States has had, instead of revising its view of how the world should work, was they try and go in and strong arm and bully so-called allies or other countries that feel the pressure from the United States who could be brought into this alliance. And that has proven successful only to a very small degree. And even the tip of the iceberg, look what's happening with the Europeans, our greatest allies in NATO, right? They had Li Chang there, France, greeting him, talking about, expending money and financing projects in Africa, or even in Germany, trying to create new agreements with German industry. This has been very successful even among the allies. The U.S. hasn't figured out a way to deal with this except to carry that big stick, to speak loudly, and if necessary, to use it in a war. And that's what they've been done. And the second thing is that they've no longer been scared of nuclear war. I mean, the relationship with the Soviet Union had an entirely different group of people. I think that Ray can probably tell you that, who had an entirely different mentality. Even George Kennan, who was the so-called author of Containment, was a much more cautious person than anybody we have today. and tried to set it right. Even his containment, he thought, had gone off the rails because it was, it was making the U.S. and Europe hostile to the Soviet Union, which was not his purpose in issuing this long telegram. But that generation has passed, and we have now a large group of younger people, largely educated under the British imperial influence in our universities, in our think tanks. See how many Brits are on the television now on US TV or making these comments or being our experts. That's what we have to deal with, is this cultural shift. I just like to mention also what Ray said about the relations between Russia and China. That relationship goes back a long way. I mean, to the 15th century, during the ancient Qing dynasty. The Qings did not allow generally religious groups to come in. The Jesuits became the first exception to that, but there always was an Orthodox church in Beijing. So, I mean, they treated them differently. And the years of the Sino-Soviet split, which was in one sense unfortunate, but also, given the conditions of the Cold War, it wasn't necessarily a totally bad thing, was more a question of who was going to lead the socialist revolution. And that created problems. But underneath, to look at all the scholars, even today, who are in science, especially those in their 70s and 80s, their second language is Russian, not English, right? So, I mean, those ties have always been there. It is not an alliance at this point. It is greater than alliance. It is that something that's not going to be broken. I think there are two, Ray can correct me if I'm wrong here. I think there are two views within the intelligence community. There are those who feel that China can be pulled away from Russia. And there are those who believe that China and Russia are locked at the hips. They'll never be broken away, and we have to prepare for war with both of them. I think that second attitude is now the dominant attitude. And I think when Secretary Blinken, whatever his motives may have been in going there, and they're probably various, that he got that message as well from the Chinese in raising this issue of trying to pull them away, possibly from in supporting what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. I think he got a very clear message on that. But it's an alliance. I don't think it will become a military alliance unless Russia is threatened to be destroyed. That may change things. Or if China themselves are attacked. That is, if this Taiwan issue goes to a situation where they can arm missiles to attack Fujian province, as they used to do during the Chiang Kai-shek era, I think the Chinese would probably attack. They have the ability. We've seen what they could do. They don't want to do it. Their attitude is this geoeconomics, right? That they feel the strong point is that the world is open to development policies. And therefore, we can avoid a war if we can spread this thing out to everybody sees that's in their general interest. And that's the way they would like to go. Now, if things turn differently, of course, it's going to be other people are going to be having the say in that. But I just want to say that about this relationship.
Sure. Great. Ray?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. And thanks, Dennis. Let me be very brief on this. Exceptionalism. Albright talked about the indispensability. I mean, if you're exceptional, if you're indispensable, you have sort of like what we used to in the Bronx call an attitude, right? Now, the last vestige of U.S. diplomacy vis-a-vis Russia came in September of 2013 when Obama was in a fix. He had watched Iraq. He had been tricked into Afghanistan, and now they wanted him, the neoconservatives, to attack Syria with more than just these little bands of terrorists that we were ruling, but overtly with these Tomahawk missiles, right? So Obama, to everyone's surprise and my satisfaction, says, I think this time we should go to Congress. Go to Congress? Wow. Yeah. Well, actually, Article 1, I think, says Congress. Yeah. Congress has the authority, the exclusive authority to start wars, declare wars. So we'll go to Congress. Well, the neocons were really up in arms. They didn't want to go to Congress. Okay, and I have a personal experience. If we have time, I'll tell you about it. Anyhow, what happens? Well, by providence or happenstance, depending on the way you look at this, Putin was scheduled to go up to St. Petersburg for one of these, I think, one of these economic conferences, right? And luckily, John Kerry, his arch neocon Secretary of State, was busy doing other things. So what happens? Obama arrives in St. Petersburg, and on that same day, Vladimir Putin lets himself say on Russian radio, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, the word he used is the German. He said in Russian, he lies, он врет, он знает, что врет. Это печально. Okay. He lies. He knows he's lying. This is really too bad, unfortunate. Okay. Now, Obama arrives, and he and Putin go behind closed doors without Kerry. Now, Putin says, Mr. President, I know and I applaud your unwillingness to start yet another war. I mean, I think that's a good idea, and I can help you. Oh, how can you help? I persuaded the Syrians to get rid of all the chemical weapons that they have under UN supervision on a ship specifically outfitted for destruction of such weapons. You have a couple of those ships, Mr. President, and so you don't have to make war on Syria. Obama says, huh? Really? Kerry didn't tell me about this. Look tomorrow at what the Syrian foreign minister says, Mr. President. And sure enough, he announces, we have agreed to destroy all our chemical weapons under UN supervision at sea on one of these ships. And Obama says, wow. In other words, Putin pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire. I mean, it was also to Putin's advantage not to have a war in Syria, of course. But the short answer is, look, Obama got a bailout from Putin. Why do I mention all that? Well, because on the 12th of September, 2013, Putin had an op-ed in the New York Times. What did he say in that op-ed? Well, I remember him saying in the last paragraph, which I'm told, I was reliably told in the past, and I have confirmation now that Putin himself crafted this last paragraph. I made some notes from it. He said, I am very grateful. I welcome the progress that has been made, not only between our two countries, the US and Russia, but between us personally. The only problem I have is with the notion that the US is exceptional, which President Obama has just said the previous week. I don't think any country is entitled to consider itself exceptional. There are big countries, there are small countries, there are countries closer to democracy, countries still struggling to become democratic. But here's the kicker. But when the Lord looks down at, we are all different. But when the Lord gives his blessings to the world, we must not forget that God created us all equal. Huh? I mean, that cuts right across the grain of some countries are more equal than others, right? You know, there have been books written about that kind of stuff. So here's the notion. To the degree that the United States considers itself more equal, as personified by people who've gone to more equal schools, with ivy dripping down like Blinken and Nod and Sullivan and Nuland and people like George Stephanopoulos, okay, they consider themselves elite. I call them the effete elite, okay? Now, as long as they think the U.S. is exceptional, they're going to get the rest of the world completely against them, and they're going to suffer lots of defeats. My point is simply this, that explains what's left of U.S. diplomacy. Of course, you have to crank in the secretaries of state that Trump, that Pompeo, for God's sake, and the one now, Blinken. You have to crank them in, because if they come out of that exceptional framework, that's what you get. Let me tell you this vignette, because it was a personal one. It was right at this time when Putin was bailing out Obama. I was on the top of the CNN building, real fancy building in downtown Washington. I had an interview with the BBC. I go in this little room and I do my interview, and I come out and I open the door a little too fast and I knock over this little guy, right? Who is it? Oh, my God. I says, it's Paul Wolfowitz. No, I said, thank you, Jesus, for teaching me about nonviolence. It really came in handy then. So I said, oh, sorry. And he's, well, watch where you're going. Yeah. So then I look, and on the boob tube on the screen there, with wait a second, all the neocons in the world were there. There's Lieberman across there. Wolfowitz, they were all there, and they're watching some fella talk how bad Obama was to work out this deal with Putin. And then Lieberman and Wolfowitz go into this separate room to do their interview. And the first thing that Wolfowitz says is, this is garbage about going to the Congress about a permission for making a war. For God's sake, the Syrians are guilty. We should be making a war. So McGovern pulls out the little constitution that Dennis Kucinich gave him, and he underlines the portion of Article 1, Section 8, which says only Congress can declare war. He rips it out, okay, and he waits in the elevator shaft between the room where Wolfowitz and Lieberman were being interviewed and where he was, okay? And he waits. Now, this is very ornate. It looks like the UAE, as I imagine it, So I'm waiting there, and all of a sudden they come out. And now you have to know the ways of Washington to understand this, but I say, hey, Paul, how you doing? I'm Ray McGovern. Now, you never, in Washington, you never say, who's Ray McGovern? No, you could have met him. He could be important. After all, I was all, I was all presentable. Oh, how are you? I said, well, listen, hey, Paul, you got a second? Because I got this Constitution here. I pulled out Article 1. It talks about Congress has that. You should. How long you been a senator? Oh, 22. Oh, and then the other guy, Lieberman, sort of slinking away, and I said, hey. And then this beautiful, beautiful red-haired, 6-foot-tall model comes out, and she looks down at what's happening, and she says, "Oh, gentlemen, I'm so sorry." And I look up at her. I say, I'm really sorry too. Why do you let these two clowns go on your boob tube there? Well, they don't even know what the sentence. Well, that was the end. That was my last CNN invite. But what's the point here? The point here is that everybody watching what Wolfowitz and Lieberman said, I mean, they kind of believed it, and more than that, this crew that was assembled there in this big room watching the boob tube, they didn't have these flashy little ties. They had black ties on or dark ties. They looked like it was a funeral. They looked like Wolfowitz's mother had been run over by a car or something. It was a gloomy atmosphere because they didn't get the war that they wanted. Now, that was the last time. Now, they get the war that they want. The only trouble is they don't know a damn thing about war. None of them wore a uniform except maybe this big guy, Austin, who I guess he played football at West Point or something. I don't know. Anyhow, nobody knows anything about war, and the Russians do know a lot about war. And so I just hope that Prigozhin doesn't dislodge Putin at this point, because I have no guarantee that the person that would take Putin's part or his role or his post would be better for the West than Putin himself, who I consider to be a very moderate, very thoughtful protector of the security of his own country, and that is precisely why he felt he had no choice but to clean up the Ukraine.
I'm going to use that as an answer to a question that you had been asked, but I think you can elaborate if you need to. But it was simply this was Sam saying, unfortunately, I believe that the risk of nuclear war will become greater if Russia ends up getting too weak as a result of current internal problems with the Wagner Group. Again,
I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, Sam had another part to his question, or another question actually, which was that World War II was decades ago. The Berlin Wall is long gone. When can Germany be cleansed from the other military bases other than its own? And in that context, others have asked some other questions along that line. And I suggested that people might do a little exercise, which is look up the number of American troops presently stationed in places like South Korea or like Japan or the Philippines or Poland or Romania or various other countries, and just ask the question, why are these people there? Because I think that's not very clear, particularly to people under the age of 35. They hear stories about 800 military bases around the world, but they don't really have too much of a sense of how and why this continues to go on. So I'll put that out there, and I'll ask Ray if you have something to say right away, and then I'll ask Bill if he has any comments. We have one last feature of what we're going to do today. So any comment on that, Ray, or should we?
Well, I've taken up enough airtime here. I'm going to defer to Bill on that, who knows just about as much as I do about these things.
Well, I think one should ask really Helga to get the decisive answer on this, but I'll tell you what I think on that. And I, of course, was a soldier in Germany in the 1960s, late 1960s, and we were training to defend the Fulda Gap. I was a medic, but we were also involved in military training. And it was really not clear. I mean, it wasn't clear what we were doing there because nobody thought that there would be a war. But the fact of the presence of these troops, remember, they started to draw them down at a certain point, which you would think would give Germany a little more leeway of not being, under the direct thumb of the United States. And now, of course, that has all changed with the war in Ukraine. But I think the basic problem is not the U.S. military presence per se. It is the psychological shift of a country that was occupied for 40, 50 years, effectively. So it wasn't the fact of the troop, it was the fact of the occupation, the psychological fact of the occupation, that nothing could be done effectively without turning to the occupier and getting the okay from the top dog. I'll remind you, I mentioned George Kennan earlier, and he spent a lot of time in Russia, but a lot of time in Germany. And after the war, he was not in favor either of the division of Germany. He felt that Germany could be consolidated and that there were forces in Germany, a lot of people who had been frightened, who had been, in hiding sometime, and they were capable of taking upon themselves their own mission rebuilding the nation. But that was ignored. Germany remained divided, until more recently, and that was the story of the occupation. So the EU and this whole menagerie of relations that they have really kind of is the petticoat that keeps them in that psychological state. And it could happen that at a certain point when their country is seriously damaged by the economic crisis, and it's moving in that direction right now, that they will break with that. We saw a little tendency of that in the visit of Li Chang to Germany, where Germany did not play the same role of decoupling or de-risking. They played that down because that's not in their interest. That may come to the fore again, but I think it's more the psychological than the actual troops on the ground.
Mm-hmm. So go ahead. Please go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that, Bill. I think you got that quite right. I would just say that, I spent 5 years in Germany in the 60s and the 70s. Some of my best friends are Germans, so I have to say that, of course. But 90 years ago, when the Reichstag, the German parliament, was burned down, sort of like 9/11, and used as a pretext to go after those damn communists that burned it down and everybody else who questioned whether Hitler was the right answer, the Germans reacted with sheepish submissiveness. I challenge you to say those two words together. I'll say it again. Sheepish submissiveness. Now, after the war, after they saw the result of their sheepish submissiveness, they could be submissive to a new breed of character, namely an enlightened West, where the West would take care of their defense against the Soviet Union, and they could prosper economically. And so they prospered economically. And they saw no reason to devote 2% or even less than that to military spending. And so these Leopard 2 tanks don't work. And so all this stuff that the Germans are supplying to Ukraine are not going to change anything. Why? Because the West was not prepared for this. Now, why was the West not prepared for this? Because they did not discern any threat from Russia. Was that a big mistake? Were they mistaken? No. There was no threat from Russia. They were absolutely right to devote their economies to prosperity. Okay. What happened? The West, under the tutelage of Victoria Nuland, did a coup in Kiev, and the West expanded to the east, threatening Russia, incorporating parts of the old Soviet Union in the Baltic, and then Ukraine. And with this coup in Kiev, they said, let's make Ukraine part of NATO, and let's take over Sevastopol in Crimea, Russian Navy base since Catherine the Great, for God's sake, about the time of our revolution. And the Russians said, no more, we're not going to allow that. Okay, so when did this threat from Russia come? Well, look at the Western rhetoric. Before February 22nd or 23rd, 2014, no Western rhetoric about the threat from Russia. After the coup in Kiev, lots of rhetoric about that. Why? Because the Russians weren't going to put up with the notion that NATO would take over Ukraine officially as well as de facto with the arms they were already sending in there, and certainly not their sole all-weather warm water port in Sevastopol. So all I'm saying here is that if you think of why the West was not prepared for a war with Russia, is because they perceived no threat from Russia. And were they right in perceiving no threat from Russia? Yes, they were completely correct in perceiving no threat. Until when? Until we overthrew the duly elected government in Kiev and then perpetrated for 7 years a war against the Russian speakers in Donetsk and Lugansk to the tune of 14,000 people killed, 5,000 more since this new war began. And, there comes a limit to what the Russians will tolerate. And that's why, to the degree one feels a threat from Russia, well, the threat is limited to Ukraine, but NATO is actively engaged now, and NATO is singularly unprepared. And when you get the Director of National Intelligence of the United States of America saying, the Russians, they have no indigenous capability to produce weapons. They're running out of weapons, running out of ammunition. Well, that's not only completely wrong, but the obverse is correct. NATO has no capability of that. And the reason NATO has no capability of that is because they started it, right? NATO challenged Russia in Ukraine, completely unprepared for what Russia might do to safeguard what Putin sees as his national security interests. NATO was unwilling to negotiate, and that's why we have the situation in Ukraine now. So, this business about NATO and Ukraine and no defense and no threat from Russia, well, I'll leave it there because people are sort of mystified. They say, well, wait a second, why is it that all these countries, Poland, the Baltics, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, why they saw no threat from Russia? Well, it's pretty simple. There was no threat from Russia. Is there a threat from Russia now? Yeah, in Ukraine. Are they going to be able to redress this threat? No. Why? Simple answer, because the West is running out of weapons. And the only danger now is the West will think that this is some sort of existential political threat with an election coming up in the United States, so as to prompt them to use bizarre methods such as tactical nuclear weapons. I'll leave it at that.
What I'd like to do is bring something to the attention of both of you. Well, you guys know about it, but Ray, I see that behind you, you have JFK and the Unspeakable, the book on the, not merely on the assassination, but on the life and times of John F. Kennedy, written by Mr. James Douglas. Thank you for putting that up. One of the characters that goes unmentioned, or so far has gone unmentioned in general, who very much affected that Kennedy American University speech, is Pope John the 23rd, who died actually on June 3rd, a week before the speech was given. And he had written an encyclical called Pacem in Terris. I want to call your attention to one passage from that, of each of you, and have you comment on it. And this is section 53 and 54. Attainment of the common good is the purpose of the public authority. And he says, men both as individuals and as intermediate groups are required to make their own specific contributions to the general welfare. The main consequence of this is that they must harmonize their own interests with the needs of others and offer their goods and services as their rulers shall direct, assuming, of course, that justice is maintained and the authorities are acting within the limits of their competence. Those who have authority in the state must exercise that authority in a way which is not only morally irreproachable, but also best calculated to ensure or promote the state's welfare. And then point number 54, the attainment of the common good is the sole reason for the existence of civil authorities. In working for the common good, therefore, the authorities must obviously respect its nature and at the same time adjust their legislation to meet the requirements of the given situation. And I wanted to call everybody's attention to it, but of course, this is a papal encyclical. This is a quote, a theological document. And these are positions that the Pope has reached at that time. But of course, as a process of deliberations, particularly with Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. I'll just note that the Pope had made a very important address in October of '62 about the war, about the impending danger of nuclear war. He had been diagnosed with cancer in September of '62, and so the encyclical, which came out in April of '63, was considered a kind of last will and testament, and the statement that he wanted to make to the world about what he thought would constitute the basis for peace on earth. And in the Kennedy speech at American University, he references this idea, not just peace in our time, but peace for all time, something that he was very much involved in thinking about. And so I'd like to just get reflections from both of you on what we've just referenced in terms of sections 53 and 54, but also about the kind of dialogue that clearly went on at that brink of disaster, and then among the various voices that were being heard at that time, either on the question of peace itself, that would be, of course, JFK, Khrushchev, and the Pope, and also in a different way, and later on the question of peace itself, Martin Luther King, who gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, actually given it initially in its draft form a couple of days in June of '63 at Cobo Hall in Detroit, and then repeated it on the Mall in Washington. So, Bill, let's start with you and then go to Ray.
I think Ray had his hand up. He was eager to jump in here. I'll let him go first there. Ray.
Thanks, Bill. Fair is fair. Well, Dennis and Bill, suffice it to say that our first son was in utero when John Kennedy made that speech, and when John the 23rd died. Guess what we named our son? You got it, John. The key to what Pope John the 23rd said has to do with justice, okay? And of course, John the 23rd came out of the tradition where justice is in the biblical sense simply the presence of justice is the presence of peace, okay? You can't have justice without peace, okay? Now, actually, I got that wrong. You can't have peace without justice. Now, I was so elated in those days that principled and educated and enlightened people had come to the fore that I studied a lot about this, and I learned that justice in the biblical sense, well, it comes from the Aramaic word tzedkah, okay? Now, it's very different from the American concept of justice. American concept of justice, of course, you have a blindfolded lady, of all things, unable to look at either scale lest she prejudice her way, right? Okay? Well, guess what? The biblical concept of justice is biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the Anawim, the hated, the dispossessed poor, the widow, the orphan, the refugee, okay? And the American bishops, many of whom were appointed by John the 23rd, got it right. They said in a major letter in 1974 that we Catholics talk a lot about the preferential option for the poor, right? Okay. We're going to tell you what that means. What it means is, said the U.S. Catholic bishops, no one is entitled to accumulate still more of what he or she doesn't need when others lack the basic necessities of life. That's what it is, folks. Okay. Now, there are a lot of rich Catholics, a lot of rich people that didn't like that one bit. Okay. But my point is simply this. If you don't have justice, you're not going to have peace. And now we have the lily white, wealthy West arrayed against the underprivileged people of the South, of Africa, of places in Asia, places in China that have not yet been brought up as 800 million people already have to civilized standards. You have the lily white, wealthy West against the rest of the world, lots of them in dire need of justice, lots of them in dire need of a preferential option for the poor. Now, what does that mean? That means we spend lots of money on armaments, we pollute the atmosphere, largely because of these armaments, and we're not doing it. So all I'm saying is that was an opportunity lost. Now, with a new Kennedy coming on the scene, and if Bobby Kennedy is really believing and thinking what he says, and I believe he is, then we have an option here. We have an option to right things that have been wronged. We have an option to, as long as Bobby Kennedy is not assassinated, and I say that advisedly, we have an option to emphasize the kinds of things that most of us believe, not only Judeo-Christians, but, Confucius himself talked about the golden rule. The way he put it, I think, was don't do anything to somebody else that you wouldn't want them to do to you, right? Love your neighbors is what love your enemies is what I said. So enough for me, but I see this as a kind of a liminal event in the history of our politics, if indeed we have another voice, a voice that talks about justice, as John Kennedy and Pope John 23rd talked about giving preferential option to those who have not been advantaged, really, who have not been taught to see themselves as exceptional or even indispensable, then we got something good going here. And I think it's up to us to follow through, because in a way, this is a second chance, a second breath. Thanks.
Bill?
Yeah, look, the atmosphere was much different in those days. You've got to understand that the Kennedy speech, Pacem in Terris, this was the era when, the countries of Africa and Asia joining the United Nations. Kennedy, when he went to the UN, I guess in 1960, 61, talked about the first development decade. So there was a whole aura, atmosphere of optimism with regard to these development policies. I remember I have a book downstairs, which is a picture book, which I think was based on Pacem in Terris, that showed you, all the poverty and problems and relations with people, when they don't have economic goods, that those things were spread around. People really, caught the bug in some sense. And I agree with Ray that's really what we have to do now, because you had this 40, 50 years of this insanity, this British exceptionalism, which didn't exist in those days. Kennedy didn't see himself as exceptional, except in the fact that he had the duty to bring countries together. As mentioned, to talk with Dennis earlier on this, from the get-go, that space program was not America first, we're going to get there to the moon. It was, how do you get the Soviet Union involved in a project which is the common aims of mankind? And for 4 years, There were discussions back and forth, and the Soviets rejected that. Even at the last minute, Khrushchev said, "We're not going to the moon. That's going to be a waste of money." And Kennedy agreed with Jim Webb, saying, "Well, then they should join us because there's no competition. They should come along on our flight." But that didn't fly either. But that was the atmosphere. And that's what has changed. And everything that, we can do with this, the political campaigns, Diane's campaign, Robert Kennedy's campaign in particular, has the potential of raising among Americans those commitments again, even among those who didn't live at that time, because these things don't really disappear with people who, were touched by John Kennedy. People know their history to some extent. It remains as a tradition, and that's what should be pushed forward. I will also note that I saw the sections that you talked about in that particular section of Parchamenteris, and I was struck by the fact that Ray, who's read Xi Jinping's speeches, can confirm this, that there's no contradiction on these points. At some points, maybe. I mean, China is still suspicious of religion. They have religious. I went to mass in China, in Shanghai, but they still are wary of that as a foreign influence there. So they have some restrictions there and watch it very close. But they are trying to get a relationship with the Vatican. But the concept of man, as it's interpreted in those documents by Xi, is completely consistent with what John Paul John 23rd was actually saying in that Parchamenteris. And I think that means that if we can revive that concept, and people would begin to understand what the Chinese are doing with this population alleviation, right? There was no population alleviation following Parchamenteris. They would also understand that it's the notion of the unique position of the individual in the world as a representative of human intelligence, the human mind, that this must be fostered, this must be given, the abilities to develop their capabilities, to move into fields that they feel that they can give a contribution. That was all in the Parchamenteris, but it's also, you'll see that all the time in the speeches of Xi Jinping. So it's like a convergence. If the United States had that attitude, there would be more of a convergence with People's Republic of China.
Okay, well, Bill Jones, Ray McGovern, thanks a lot for being with us today. We've had a pretty comprehensive discussion, and I think a lot of people have not only gotten a lot out of it, which is certainly judging from the questions and from a lot of the activity in the chat room, but also there's another element, which is that some people are asking the question, okay, well, I think I want to actually do this. I think we should get involved. What can I really do? And I will say that there are many things, everything from the kind of interventions that people have seen Jose Vega and Kind and Thistlethwaite and other people do, which we can refer to. I think everybody knows, if you don't know what that means, it means you stand up and you make your voice heard in whatever way you can. Sometimes that's in a congressional office. Sometimes that's in confrontation with some people from think tanks. And sometimes that's simply out on the street corner talking. And then there's also social media, various ways of spreading the message. There's the International Peace Coalition, which Helga Sepp-LaRouche has just put together, in which people are joining and they're getting active. And there's a lot of activity that's needed there. Everything from doing voice-to-text transcriptions for the purpose of getting out press releases to raising money to looking for the possibility, particularly as we approach slightly later dates like August 6th. There's a whole discussion about what might be done on the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. There's much that's being discussed. So if you want to be involved, get in touch with us, and there are various ways in which you can do that. What we're going to do in conclusion is we're going to replay just a bit from that Joe Rogan spot on Robert Kennedy, because there are a couple of things I'd like to point out. And in seeing it again here, it's very short, but there were two young women who were discussing what he was saying. So on a particular show, and I'm going to let it clip play a little bit because there's a point I'd like to make about their discussion, their response to hearing the much older RFK Jr. say what he says about how he thinks about this issue of how he has to confront his own mortality.
Let's watch some of that.
But what do you think happens when you get into office? Like, if you're talking about your uncle who was assassinated, and you believe the intelligence agencies were a part of that, what happens to you?
Well, I got to be careful. I'm aware of that, and I'm not. I'm aware of that danger, and I don't live in fear of it, at all. But I'm not stupid about it, and I take precautions.
I am interested in what kind of precautions he's taking, Jess, because I think if the CIA decides that he is persona non grata, there's only so much you can do.
Someone get your boy a bulletproof helmet. I don't know what else we can do. I know he's out in public. He's posting videos on the campaign trail. He's traveling quite a bit. I mean, if they take him out, will it be before he gets into public office? I'm not quite sure. I think if RFK ends up getting assassinated, it's going to open up a Pandora's box of what's happened with the intelligence community in the United States over the past half a century or more. And so I love when we have members of the Kennedy family giving some insight as to what they believe went down. It seems to be that the consensus generally is JFK, not RFK, but JFK was not a fan at all of how the CIA and covert operations that were done during the Cold War era conducted themselves. He was very critical of it. He didn't like the CIA as a branch of the federal government. And so because of that, it would make sense that he would be a target by the CIA. So I don't think what RFK Jr. said there is some kind of wild conspiracy theory. I think if we look at the pattern of behavior of the CIA and the intelligence community in the United States, it pretty much tracks.
Yeah, I mean, it seems big.
So that's important for, I think, several reasons. First of all, because there's a almost fatalistic quality, which I don't think is really necessarily the fault of the commentators. There's a reason for that. There's a fatalistic quality in America around this matter, but there need not be. There's also, however, the observation, which is correct, if anything like that happened, it would open up many other things that would blow up. But now let's put that in the context of today in Moscow. Let's put that in the context of the fact that what RFK Jr. has stated is that the Ukraine policy is a fraudulent policy, that it was true that the NATO nations provoked Russia, that more importantly than that, and he does disagree with Russia's special military operation. But what his point is that you have a circumstance in which something has to be completely changed in America's approach on the questions of not military, not just war and peace, but the nature of humanity. How do we think about the Russian people? And that he talked about how John F. Kennedy Jr. John F. Kennedy made the point that you had to walk in their shoes. You had to see the Russians from their standpoint. What are their security interests? But not only that, what are they as human beings? That you can't talk about them as being so evil as to be disapproving of their existence. More importantly, what does that say about your own self-conception if you entertain those kinds of ideas? Ray McGovern referenced this notion of exceptionalism, at least as Vladimir Putin had discussed it in the particular op-ed that he prepared for the New York Times. Well, the idea here is that in the American Declaration of Independence, it begins by saying that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. This is something that's at the very fundament of the nature of the composition of the United States. And we're coming up in a few days, actually, on the anniversary of the deliberations that created the United States in the form of the Declaration of Independence and the discussions at Philadelphia's now called Independence Hall, when some 54 delegates and associates got together and they composed what was a treasonous document from the standpoint of the Crown, but was a document that argued, as was said, that when in the course of events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bonds that have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, that a just respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they declare the causes of their separation. And therefore, the idea of this is it's not enough to say you're independent. It's not enough to have an independent judgment. It's not enough to say, well, I don't agree with crimes being committed, including by that government entity of which I am a part. I'm in a nation and it is governed. And that government entity carrying out those actions is being done, in fact, in my name, regardless of the fact that I have an independent judgment that is not what I happen to agree with. That's not good enough. There comes a time, and the time is now, it was referenced by Scott Ritter in a different way, in which there is a requirement before, if you will, the laws of nature and of nature's God, that one stand in behalf of that which is declared to be one's, if you were, immortality. What is it that you stand for, that you're willing to give your life for, or will give your life for, one way or the other, if you think about it? Because either you will, in a cowardly way, deny the reality of what's going on today and tomorrow, perhaps in Moscow, in your name, in part. Not saying that Prigozhin is necessarily an agent of, because I don't think we know that as of this evaluation. We have a certain approach, and there are things that we believe, and there are things that we have as hypotheses. But all of that has to be proven. But what we do know is we do know that the policy that John Kennedy stood for is not the policy of this government of the United States. And that policy is not the policy of this government of the United States because of the way he was assassinated, and his brother was assassinated, and others were assassinated, like Martin Luther King and others. Or for that matter, individual activists like Fred Hampton, known to have been killed by the FBI in 1969 in Chicago, and no one has been brought to justice. Not only that, no one even brings that up, except, sort of voce. It's just automatically assumed and accepted. Oh, yes, we know the FBI did this, but there's no justice. I think that the concept here is that where we are today and what we can think about in terms of this issue of peace is it's fully within the power of everybody listening to me and everybody that has access to the American University speech of John Kennedy to take up Robert Kennedy Jr.'s challenge, which he made to the present ongoing Biden administration, that this must be the maximums of the Kennedy speech have to be adopted. And I think that's also true in the practice of each American. This is not a question of partisanship. This is not a question of talking about elections. This is a question of whether or not we elect to continue to survive. And so as we close today's show, let me say that every minute now counts. Every way in which you can support the efforts of what the LaRouche organization is doing, or co-thinkers, or some people who are now associating with it, or some of the efforts in which it's been involved, which involve very disparate personages who have many disagreements with many things. Now is the time to act. We call upon you to do that, and we hope that you'll join us in taking those actions, which are joyous actions, urgent actions, necessary actions, and truly human, in the same way in which the Declaration of Independence characterized what true independence of truly human, independent people and free people is. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon.
Awesome.